Oh, by the way, we actually did touch on that in a past episode as well. I think most people who followed the game at a high level agree. Like, it's not like League of Legends. It's not really like 5 roles and you need one of each. Like, spoiler, in CSGO it isn't like that either. Like, we have roles that we say like that to describe, but it's like, my analogy is basketball. Like, in basketball, when you have the 5 roles, most teams don't really have a centre in the modern day, for example. Tons of players are really just a shooting guard. Like, really, that's more just like a very simplistic model of the game. And then within that, it's just a way to explain to someone how I set my team up. So if my team's loads of small ball, I don't really have a fucking power forward, do it? You know what I mean? Like, so Gio, what are your thoughts on this? Obviously, it's a really open-ended question, but do you have a sense of what you think the most valuable roles are for a team?
It's interesting because I think it's meta dependent, because in the meta that dominated stage 1, I would have probably said the smoke player was the most important. But in the current meta, I can totally understand why you may not think the smoke player is the most important. I probably don't either, because there's a lot more flexibility in the current meta. It's a lot faster and it allows for a lot more stylisticness. I don't know if that's a word, but like it sort of allows for you to pick your strengths and play at them. And I think that in a meta like that, an initiator is, or at least a good initiator, is always going to be universally important, because the initiator is the only person really who can gather offensive preemptive information. So like the Sentinel can gather information throughout the course of the map and can gather a lot of defensive information. But the person who can have a one-up on the info that will allow you to make any kind of engagement, whether it's the first engagement in the game or not, that is, if you have someone who's very good at that, that's always going to give you an advantage. Because as with any first-person shooter, and I mean, this is, I suppose to an extent true in MOBAs, but maybe not quite in the same way, because there are still respawns available in them. But in especially first-person shooter, like getting the opening kill is massive as a statistical advantage for you getting around.
Historically, in Counter-Strike, the stats usually something like 75% of the time you win the round if you get the opening kill.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's ridiculous. So I think having someone, at least right now, who can have an advantage in being able to get information that facilitates that is unbeatable. I find it really interesting with the other stuff, because yes, putting op second, I think is probably something I would agree with. Like, I would either put it second or third, and the other role that I would contend that with is the anchor, which is what you've put in third. So like I'm kind of along the right lines. The reason that I say that is because yes, the person who's really highly mechanically skilled, who can just pop off and whatever, can be so influential on the way that the game goes. But I think in Valorant, and I'm sure there is a similar thing in CS, but again, I don't really know much about CS, so is that your control over a post plant is super, super influential in how things go in Valorant. And I think, therefore, your anchor, i.e. the person who's guarding the site and holding a site, how they play can really make a difference in how something like a post plant goes. But I think that so much of the round, like the mid round, because that's a very late round sort of consideration.
When you say that, by the way, like people won't know what you mean by that. I presume you mean, like, for example, if they can delay the opponent getting onto the site, if they can take one extra guy, I mean,
all sorts of things
use
like
utility
that.
and stuff,
whether
right?
It's like delaying the opponent getting onto the site, being able to provide information to the rest of your team so that they can rotate, and delaying that time. But also, if the enemy team manages to get a plant down and you need to come up with a strategy to be able to actually get a defuse on the spike, right? Because like you need to hold back everybody else. And I think the person who has the most information about the very site on which that happens is a very important person in that. But it is very specific to the late round. Whereas like the opper, the star player, let's say, can have influence on almost any part of the round that can be very like pivotal. So whether that's them getting the opening kill, whether it's them like holding mid in the mid round and they get a kill then that opens up certain space, whether it's that a post plant has begun and they manage to pick off someone who is holding a really important part of the site. So maybe I would go for the opper second, just because there are more points in a round in which maybe they have such a massive influence, whereas like an anchor maybe feels a little bit more specific.
And then there's attack also, right? Like the op can also impact attack, whereas anchor's a little bit more defensive.
Yes, I mean it kind of, when I say post-plant, I mean it ambiguously in terms of both attack and defense. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Right, that was what confused me. I thought you just meant, because we use anchor usually just for the CT position in Counter-Strike. I thought you meant what the person defending meant, but you meant also the guy who's sort of like lurking. Yeah, he's going to be the one who comes in for the clutch, right? For the post-plant. Right, I see what you mean.
I think that's the interesting thing about the anchor role as well, right? Because an anchor could be like, let's say, a smoke player who, when you're on the CT side, is like holding a site, right? But it could also be like what you often see, especially on the T side, is there's going to be a sentinel, and they are the person who's on the other side of the map, lurking on a site. So that is not necessarily role specific, and that comes back to that argument about whether or not these definitions fit within the Riot defined roles that we actually have in the game, because not necessarily they are always applicable to specific roles or whatever. And then that's why the argument about Nats, for example, Nats, who was considered for a long time potentially the best player in the world, mostly picked sentinel roles, at least at the time, and it's because he redefined the way of lurking, and that is a T-side sort of way of playing, right? So I think that can be very influential, but I think that the op role is probably more universal, so maybe yes, I would give that the edge. I think that the smoke role specifically is really team dependent, and that's maybe a bit of a cop-out. But I think that you get some roles, and yes, I'm going to go by your logic where you remove the IGL aspect of it, because oftentimes IGLs are smokes, but it's not necessarily the fact that they're smokes is what gives them the value, right? But I think that, especially now in this kind of meta where it is more about like, what is your play style? What are your strengths? Like a smoke role could be the most important person on your team, just because like that's how your team thrive. That's how they play. And you still play a very strictly site setup way of playing that we saw in the meta that defined stage 1. You could be a team where that simply is not your way of playing. In Sentinels, am I going to say that their most important role is a smoke role? Hell fucking no, I'm not. I'm not going to say that. But like in other teams, and now I've got to think of a team and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but like in other teams, you may look at them and be like, is a smoke role going to be way more pivotal in the way that they set up their sites, in the way that facilitates the way they want to play? Absolutely, it could be. So I think for me, like the smoke role is probably the one that has the power to move up and down the scale the most, dependent on who the team is. Because yes, I would probably also put secondary duelist last, because secondary duelist is a supportive role in the sense that it's like what you might refer to in other games as a flex role, right? So it's kind of like, okay, you fill what you need to do. You may, and yes, a lot of times this is the KO, because the player who may have played the secondary duelist or the second duelist at the end of last year, where you may have had more double duelist compositions, they may have been pushed onto KO this year, whatever. We've seen a lot of players be put in that role. In the stage 1 meta, we saw them take on a lot more of like a very initiator heavy role. So you'd have that sort of double initiator vibe in a lot of teams. But now it's sort of like, okay, well, are you going to play it as a second duelist, or are you going to play it in a more supportive way? There's a lot of flexibility there, and it's sort of like, what does your team need? And in which case that means that the role in and of itself is not as pivotal to be like stringently executed. So it's an important role, but it's the one that has the most movement in it.
Okay.
I can just see people arguing, my favorite player is this.
Oh,
how dare you say that?
Yeah, by the way, I'll also say
my favorite player is one of those second duelists. My favorite player in all of Valorant is Zeppa, who literally is like quintessentially that role, right? So, yes. And I think he's phenomenal, and I think he had a really, really massive part to play for Cloud9's success at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year. But I think that if you were to look holistically at the scene in and of itself and the way that a lot of teams play, you can't necessarily argue that that is the most valuable role on the team.
Yep.
No, the problem there as well is that's why I purposely said it's supposed to be an open-ended discussion with spoiler. It's actually supposed to tell you more about how each person sees the game and the roles than the specific players. Like, so basically the reason, what you're saying there, Gio, absolutely is what fans will do, but they're confusing the particular for the general, aren't they? In this, like, I'll give you an example. In Counter-Strike, the greatest support player, often like an anchor, is a guy called Zipnik's a Danish player, right? Who's not actually very good now, but he was very good for a long time. The problem is this: that doesn't make his role the best role. It's like you said earlier. The reason why he was amazing is because he had the shittiest role, but made it really good. So as a result, it's like he was like found money. Because basically, the funny thing is, Elevated, even though you're not from CS:GO, it's actually a fairly similar hierarchy in CS:GO. Now, obviously, CS:GO doesn't have as rapidly changing metas, and we don't have different characters, so the game sort of retains similar fundamentals. Like basically, if I take away the role names, I just boil down to what you're talking about, what the player does. Like, spoiler, I can sort of cheat because a lot of the really good in-game leaders in Counter-Strike are the entry player anyway. And it's for exactly the reason you're saying, because what they want to do primarily is the entry, is get all the info and very quickly comm the info to the guys coming in behind them. So they're going to set up their stars. So the one area that Valorant's very different from CSGO is we don't have, like you guys do, where you set up and the duelist can go in first and just kill everyone. You usually actually have the in-game leader go in first, and then the duelist kind of baits him, takes the comms, and then uses that info to kill everyone. So in theory, actually entry would be a very important role in CS because it would just be IGL. Then also, if you put the second best role, it would probably be your star AWPer, like you're saying, because ideally you want your AWPer to be your best player anyway, and similarly to Valorant, it controls the map. It creates like tripwires where you have to cross this guy, and if he doesn't see you, you know they can't be on that side of the map. It's all great info. For the IGL, you'll notice this isn't just about what you do when you shoot the guy, it's about what you do the rounds you don't ever see a guy. And then I would probably say third is similar. That is actually where having like a lurker, the reason they are not the most important, but then they'd come in as third, is because they get all the info these other guys drew, and they use all the kills that the guy with the star did, and then they close the round out for you. And if you don't have someone who can close the round out, you could be the best IGL in the world with the best entry players in the world. You're going to lose all the games because you won't win any of the post plants. You won't make use of the advantages you got. So basically, you need to get the info so you can make the right calls and reads. You need someone who uses the info, creates the kills. And you need someone who gets the end of that and just wraps it all up in a night bow. Now, the other roles, as you're talking about, if someone's amazing at that role, maybe they go up in this hierarchy. But the point is, if you were to make a generic team where everyone had identical stats, if you built a team the way you guys are talking about, in the current meta, it sounds like that would be the best team, right?
I mean, maybe like that's the cool thing about a game like Valorant that has so many moving pieces, is that you don't really know what the best approach is yet. You know, like Optic has the best approach because they won Worlds or they won Masters. Do they actually have the best approach? I don't know. They have the best approach at that tournament, but does that mean that they still know what is like the meta going forward? We don't know, and we won't know until the next international event. And you know, coming from a game like Dota where like the meta changes like between every event, basically, I've seen like the cyclical nature of how the game develops, where it's like this thing becomes very important. Everybody focuses on countering that. Then something else becomes important because the thing that was strong is no longer strong because everybody knows how to deal with it. And like we see that happening in Valorant again. Like the times that Optic has lost, it's been because people have been really good at shutting down Yay. They don't do that consistently against Optic, which is why they win a lot. But there are certain times where Yay gets kind of shut down and Optic struggles. And I think we saw that with, like, you know, obviously the Jet nerfs. There was a lot of players who have gone way down in performance because Jet is no longer just like this ubiquitously overpowered character. And we're starting to see that in Chamber, but like there is a cycle that is happening. And I think, like Gio was saying, the smokes role, I would totally agree. In the last stage, I was like, if you have the best smokes player, you're probably going to be the best team because they just had so much impact from a role that's not supposed to have impact.
Yeah, because so much of it was relying on site setup. And actually, I just wanted to bring up like an example of a team where I would specifically put their secondary duelist above their AWPer and above their primary duelist is G2, right? Like Nukier is probably one of the biggest value bringers to that team. I know they haven't actually made it through to playoffs in EMEA, but that notwithstanding, he probably was one of the biggest value bringers to the team. The reason that Mixwell has so much value is because of what he does in the comms. And given that we are like kind of like not bringing in the IGL aspect of it into judging these roles, their actual like entry/opping role, I have at least always been not super huge. I always thought that Kellogg's, when you look at the mechanics and his ability to be a solid Jet, was always better than the way that Mixwell did it. The reason that Mixwell has stayed in the team is because he provides other things to the team. Cool, that's great. But like as an individual, I would argue that Nukier can provide so much more value mechanically and actually the way he plays the game better than Mixwell, does that mean that all secondary duelists are more valuable than the Oppa? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that G2 don't necessarily fit this sort of archetype that we've built, right?
By the way, I'd probably include Ghost in that as well. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, because like Ghost is sort of a very interesting team as well. I mean, they do have a very good Opper, but I would say that Nismo probably is more impactful in most rounds, and he's sort of like this flex secondary duelist, the Raze, the KO, that kind of stuff. I would probably pick Nismo over Koala Noob, like if I was to like start a team based off the impact alone. So it's not like every team fits this, but I definitely think like the whole question was, if I were to start a team to try and get into franchising and I wanted to build the best team possible, what would I sign first? And so,
Good. And by the way, it's even a classic question, because essentially you can have the same question in every sport, can't you? Like if it's the NFL, do I really need the quarterback best, or do I want like a defensive? But there's a million angles you can go with. Right. One thing you brought up there I thought was a perfect segue, because it's something I wanted to bring up. I alluded to it earlier. Is one of the, I won't even say a hot take, it's just a tweet. You did a tweet that actually sparked an interesting topic, which is you said that you actually think that most teams in pro play, they're too reticent to try the new agents. Like they just sort of, they're sort of in the mindset of like, just stick with the current meta, or they just think, they're just rubbish, aren't they? So like Chamber's a perfect example, because when we started this show was in the last VCT, and that was where actually Chamber was starting to be a relevant force. Like the teams who could play it, you could see some of them became the best teams. Some of those players became much more relevant players, right? You basically said you think that's like a current example of an agent where actually it's probably already OP. Too many people didn't pick it up, and almost certainly it's just going to get the teleport nerfed, right? So what do you think on that angle? Because when you're saying it like that, as someone who, like I am also in League of Legends, the idea in League of Legends, like someone would just miss for 3 months something was OP and then quickly try and use it before it was nerfed. Like you'd be an idiot in that game, basically. That's actually half the job as a coach, is to get ahead of that. So what do you think on this topic? Because it seems a bit wild.
Yeah, I mean, coming from the MOBA, like whether it's Dota or League of Legends, new pieces being added to this like vast array of options to choose from is always a very confusing thing, because there's so many available pieces that you can use already, and a lot of people are just happy to be comfortable. Like it sucks to go from being the best mid laner on whatever the popular champion is in League of Legends to being like kind of mediocre, because you don't understand how the champion works, and you have to like relearn some of the mechanics, and like your mechanics feel bad and you feel like you're not as good for a little bit, and then you get better at it. But every single time there's been like a new hero introduced into Dota, every single time there's been a new character introduced into Overwatch, it feels like it's like there is potential there for this thing to be insane. And most people are very easy to just like, they go in a couple times, they play it once or twice, it doesn't feel as good as their main agent, and then they go back to that one because they don't like losing, which is fair. But at the same time, you're just kind of like castrating what is possible to develop in that regard. And so every single time that I've seen a new agent, like KO's introduced, I was like, this agent is going to be absolutely insane. It can turn off utility. Like it's so good. It can literally stop Viper from being relevant when Viper is the most important character in the game. And sure enough, I look at the pick rates, KO's like 10%. Next event, KO's 25%. Next event, KO's 40%. It's like very clear that people are slow to pick this stuff up because they're very focused on doing what they do well and trying to perfect that. And I think that's kind of like maybe a CS mindset thing. I don't really know.
I've got a tangent on it. Let's keep going. It's all right.
And so I do think that the teams that have maybe a little bit more like diverse coaching structure, or the teams that have, diverse backgrounds of their players, are probably a little bit more likely to pick up these characters as they come out, and then figure out the abusive mechanics. Because the thing about these character-based games is the devs are going to do a lot of work developing the character, but at the end of the day, they kind of just want to get the character out there and make it fun. And usually, most of the time, a character gets released a little bit overpowered. That's just kind of how it goes.
That's also just the Riot way, by the way. It's just the Riot Games way.
You want people to buy the character.
Yeah, exactly.
To buy the character's cosmetics, and you want it to be fun. And the most fun way to play a character is to win the game. And so usually they come out kind of broken. Chamber's another good example. It's like, oh, look, another instant teleport. That can't be broken. Oh, wait, it absolutely is. And he has the best weapon in the game. And he literally has a Guardian for 800 credits. That seems pretty overpowered. Fade comes out, same kind of thing. It's like, okay, this character can literally find out exactly where people are and wall hack, and you can combo with another wall hack from Sova, and suddenly nobody can hide. Same thing with Astra. Okay, this character can stop any rush instantly from anywhere on the map. It's like there's a very clear pattern here, and I think that the teams that are like, and I know I'm kind of like tangentially going off here, but
sorry, I'll bring it back. Keep going.
But I understand from a competitive perspective why teams don't pick up these things, because if you're doing something that's working, why would you change?
Yes, if it's works, if it's broke, don't fix it. Yeah, it's that vibe, right? Yes,
especially if you're a salaried player that is worried, about your results. Like, you don't necessarily want to like lose 10 games in a row because you're trying something new when your job depends on winning the game. And so players are incentivized not to change if they're doing stuff that's working well, or they're incentivized to copy the best teams because those teams have clearly figured it out. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are giving up a huge amount of equity in the game by not experimenting and not doing weird stuff, whether it's in scrims or pracs or the smaller tournaments, and just like being okay looking like complete garbage for a while and then coming up with stuff that either does or doesn't work.
Sure. Okay, so here's my take on that, because I think something that you brought up that I think actually highlights a difference here is you brought up League of Legends as an example. So let's take the beginning of this year, right? League of Legends, I mean, especially off the back of Arcane being released, it was like, okay, mid lane, you're always going to see a Victor. ADC, you're always going to see a Jinx, right? Stuff like that, right? But here's the thing. You don't play Jinx in the mid lane. You don't play Jinx in the top lane. You don't play Jinx as a support. You don't play Victor in the bot lane, right? So, whereas in Valorant, you can do all of those things.
Right.
It's like, so when KO came out, and I've beaten this over the head so many times, but I will never shut up about it. When KO came out, originally everyone thought the best way to play KO was going to be as a second duelist. Mm-hmm. And actually what ended up happening was when teams tried that out in stage 3 last year, it didn't work. What happened was Cloud9 popularized the way of playing KO as a second initiator, and that worked, and people started to pick that up. Now, according to the roles within the game, that is not, I mean, KO I know is technically an initiator, but according to the roles within the game, like, you are crossing between those. In League of Legends, you do not see that except exceptionally rarely, and usually after a rework of a champion, right? So it's like, usually there is a very strict idea of where this champion is going to fit in the game. In Valorant, that simply isn't the case. So what I think we've seen in a lot of instances is there have been some teams who are reluctant to just like go into a character. I totally get that, and the statistics about pick rate don't lie, right? Numbers don't lie. But there are teams who try things out in a certain expected role, and what ends up happening is when that character ends up actually becoming a good pick to be played is not necessarily in the role that people advertised it as in the beginning. For example, Chamber, he's a Sentinel. Now, yes, does his ability or does his kit allow him to play as a Sentinel? Yeah, his trademarks are a Sentinel way of playing. Do people typically put him on the Sentinel player and play him as a Sentinel? No, they don't. They usually play him as an Opper. So you have way more flexibility to kind of go between the lines of what those roles are within Valorant than you do in something like League of Legends. And I would assume Dota, but I don't know Dota, so I'm not going to...
Dota's actually, interestingly, that's the difference. Over the place. Dota's more
really?
Like you're saying about... It's actually probably the most extreme game where you can play
I've never played it.
You can play any hero in any role if you're good enough at the hero. The second part's the key part, though. So, for example, like I'm not an expert about Dota, but I have watched it a lot. Basically, like Elevated, one thing I've always loved is when you see people who they're just like so amazing at like a carry champion. They play in like the 4 position or something because they're just gonna like min max the fucking use no resources, but just maybe they
put that in League of Legends.
That's like a supportive. That's like the support of the jungler. The jungler maybe. Yeah. So basically, in that scenario, it's like maybe they're just absurdly good with the ult or the revive or the CC6. So it's quite similar, right? Elevated. I think it sounds like it has more of a Valorant vibe, right? You can just
Yeah, absolutely. So like in that example, and I know there's probably people like just tuning out because we're talking about Dota in a Valorant podcast.
It's all good. Don't worry about it.
Like one thing that you're mentioning is like, each piece of utility that a character has, whether it's, in Valorant or Dota, is like a resource that you can use, right? And so sometimes the ultimate is really good at killing stuff, but it's also really good at CC. And so you can take that hero from being a kill hero into a CC hero and still have, then a different hero take the carry role. And in Valorant, I think it's kind of the same thing where it's like you could have KO run in with his ultimate like a Phoenix, which is kind of what people were thinking. And I'll be honest, I thought that was what he was going to do also. Yeah. Or you could have him literally be like the anchor sometimes because people are trying to hit the site and you just pop your ultimate and then they kill you, but you're still on site watching people and turning off all of their utility. And so that's like an entirely different role for a character that is seen as an aggressive character, but could also be very defensive minded as well. But the point being is that I don't think you find out about these things unless you grind the character.
Yes.
And so that's the really important thing that people need to do is as soon as a new character comes out, you have to just grind it because you're going to find weird little abuses, weird little things, weird little interactions that you won't know otherwise. Like Fade comes out, people are like, this character sucks. I saw a lot of people say that Fade is like, she's kind of mid. And then you see a team run a Fade with a Brimstone and a Raze, and you're like, oh my God, this is absolutely broken. And so it's like it changes so quickly once people actually figure out a few little tricks of like how things work.
I think there are definitely examples on the other side. And this is where I think the really important thing is, okay, so yes, I do think that if you're a professional team, it is important that you understand every character so that you have the flexibility to play all of them. You need to understand the interactions between them because even if you choose not to play that character, you need to understand how to counter them, right? Like, especially as more characters come into the game, that's not going to slow down. You need to understand that. But it's also important that you understand where your strengths are. And I think a team who are an example of this right now is the Guard, who tried very hard to adapt to this like new meta at the beginning of this stage. And it simply did not necessarily work to their strengths, right? And so it's also about like, yes, they've embraced that, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that they, presumably they practiced a lot of, these new Fade, especially at the beginning of the stage, whatever, and this new way of playing, but also being able to recognize when your strengths don't necessarily have to fit the meta, and that's okay, as long as you can utilize and harness those strengths in a way that does counter people who are playing to the meta. And I think that's a big problem that the Guard had this stage, right? Is like they were a little bit slow at the beginning. They probably could have made, it's a shoulda, woulda, coulda thing, but like they probably could have made playoffs if they did just be like, this is our game, this is how we play our game, rather than trying too much to fit into what they thought the game was. And so there's definitely a balance to be had between the two polarized opposites.
Right. I think one thing that's worth noting there, though, is like, did they switch their roles and try new agents because they liked the new agent, or did they do it because everybody else was doing it? And that's kind of like the point that I was trying to make, where it's like a lot of teams are innovators and a lot of teams are following the innovation. And if you are the innovator, I think you have a huge advantage, which is where it's important to like try the new stuff out and figure out what's going on. But the teams that are then trying to copy what the innovators are doing generally are going to be at a disadvantage because they're just doing it because it looks like it's working,
And sometimes I've found, because this is a very famous thing in League of Legends, by the way, that like NA teams, probably the worst of the four major regions, try to copy things that the Korean teams do. And the premise goes, even if you copy it, you might not understand why it works. You might not know what, you didn't invent the mechanism, as it were. You're just looking and trying to take the surface level of what they do. So you might even not be applying it correctly, Yeah,
you have to understand the why in order to actually be able to perform. Hey, that's one thing I definitely learned in my degree.
Write that down, someone. That's a good line. Okay.
There's me, like, I did a degree that's completely not related to esports, but that's definitely one thing that came up in my degree. So if I paid that amount of money for anything, let it be that.
There you go.
Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.